In our last episode, we traced David Koresh's meteoric rise within the Branch Davidian sect. We covered his early theological claims, the power struggle with George Rodin, and his eventual establishment as the prophet of Mount Carmel. We began to see how he molded Scripture to justify absolute authority, how he presented himself not merely as a teacher, but as the Lamb of Revelation itself. In today's episode, we go behind the walls of Mount Carmel from 1990 to the moment of their first deadly encounter with federal agents in 1993. We'll hear the voices of survivors, former followers, and law enforcement, alongside a psychological breakdown of Koresh's control tactics using Stephen Hassan's BITE model. How did everyday believers surrender their autonomy? Why did no one leave when things got dark? And what exactly made Mount Carmel a powder keg waiting to explode? I'm Rick Welch, and this is Prophet of Fire. By 1990, the compound at Mount Carmel wasn't just a home, it was a world unto itself. Nestled just 13 miles outside Waco, Texas, the isolated property housed more than 100 followers, men, women, and children, devoted to one man they believed to be God's appointed messenger. Days began before dawn. Followers awoke to prayer, scripture reading, and lectures from Koresh. Meals were communal. Chores were assigned. Firearm maintenance and inventory were frequent responsibilities for the men, especially after Koresh began stockpiling weapons and selling parts at gun shows. The rhythm of life was controlled, and not just spiritually. Koresh dictated sleep schedules, sexual relationships, even parenthood. Women were told they could only bear Koresh's children, and men were celibate unless Koresh granted them permission. Branch Davidian survivor David Thibodeau says, quote, "We were being molded. Everything we did, even how long we prayed, was directed. I didn't even realize it at the time, but I was losing my ability to think for myself." End quote. Koresh referred to this process as dying to the flesh. Members interpreted it as purification. In reality, it was obedience training. Some who joined were idealists, others survivors of trauma. Many were recruited through end times Bible studies that Koresh led across the U.S., the U.K., and even Australia. Once invited to Mount Carmel, the outside world fell away. Branch Davidian survivor Sheila Martin says, quote, "We thought we were chosen. That's what David said, that God brought us there. So when we cut off contact with our families, it wasn't a loss, it was a sacrifice." End quote. Koresh created a vocabulary that kept members dependent. He was the Lamb, the one who alone could interpret the 7 seals. The rest of the world was Babylon. Leaving Mount Carmel meant losing salvation. Doubt meant rebellion against God. Steve Hassan's BITE model outlines how cult leaders maintain authoritarian control by systematically breaking down an individual's autonomy. The first pillar is behavior control, the regulation of a person's physical reality. At Mount Carmel, this was absolute. Followers handed over their money, possessions, even their children. Koresh assigned living quarters, work duties, and oversaw all resources. Meals were rationed. Dress was modest. There were no holidays, no vacations, no TV. Time was a tool of submission. Branch Davidian survivor Clive Doyle says, quote, "We lived by David's clock. There wasn't a minute in the day that wasn't in some way serving the message or preparing for the seals to open." End quote. Another survivor, David Thibodeau, says, quote, "You couldn't just take a walk. You couldn't skip a service. If you were sick, you prayed it out. Even your thoughts weren't your own after a while." End quote. Marriages were dissolved. Koresh claimed exclusive spiritual and sexual access to the women. Men were required to remain celibate, including husbands whose wives now belonged to the House of David. A Branch Davidian former member, Kiri Jules, said, quote, "He told my father that God had chosen me for his purpose. I was 10 years old." End quote. Kiri's father, a devoted follower, allowed it. She later testified before Congress about being sexually abused by Koresh. These weren't just religious practices. They were structures of domination, and they were justified through one man's interpretation of Scripture. The second pillar in the BITE model is information control. This includes restricting access to outside ideas, manipulating what members hear, and creating an us versus them mentality. Inside Mount Carmel, Koresh was the only source of truth. His sermons replaced news. His biblical interpretations were treated as prophecy. Information from the outside was filtered, if not eliminated entirely. Former Branch Davidian member Dana Okimoto says, quote, "There were no newspapers, no radio. If something happened in the world, David told us what it meant." End quote. Another former member, Sheila Martin, says, quote, "TV was the devil's voice. That's what he said. He told us the government and media were under Satan's control, so we didn't trust anyone but him." End quote. Those who expressed doubt were labeled spiritually weak. Members were encouraged to report on each other's questioning. Surveillance, both overt and subtle, created fear, even among families. Former member and survivor David Thibodeau also says, quote, "There were whispers. If you were seen skipping a service, someone might tell David, and you'd get called out, not just corrected, humiliated." End quote. The community became an echo chamber. Alternative perspectives vanished. In time, Koresh's interpretation of the world became the only version of reality that mattered. The third pillar of the BITE model is thought control, shaping what members are allowed to think, believe, and imagine. At Mount Carmel, Koresh didn't just ask for belief, he demanded surrender of the mind. Koresh claimed that God had given him the ability to interpret Scripture in ways no one else could. He called it the new light. Any disagreement wasn't just dissent, it was rebellion against God. Survivor Clive Doyle says, quote, "If someone raised a question, David would stop the study and say, 'That's the voice of Satan speaking.' You learned to silence those thoughts real quick." End quote. Koresh used loaded language, terms that had deep meaning inside the group but sounded harmless outside. Words like seals, Babylon, the bride, and spiritual wife created a worldview unique to the compound. Survivor David Thibodeau says, quote, "When you're hearing every day that Babylon is coming to kill you, that outsiders are Satan's army, it changes how you think. It becomes your whole reality." End quote. To combat doubt, Koresh used thought-stopping techniques. Followers were instructed to pray, quote Scripture, or repeat key phrases when fear or skepticism crept in. Survivor Sheila Martin says, quote, "Anytime I questioned what David was doing, I'd recite verses. He said the devil attacks the mind first, so you just block the thought." End quote. This mental conditioning created reflexive obedience. Followers became unable or unwilling to challenge anything Koresh said, no matter how extreme. The final piece of the BITE model is emotional control, manipulating feelings to produce guilt, fear, loyalty, or euphoria. Koresh was a master of this. Followers were made to feel unworthy without him. Their identity, their salvation, even their family relationships were tied to their devotion to Koresh. Former member Dana Okimoto says, quote, "I was told if I left, I'd be destroyed in the fire. My children too. That's how deep the fear went." Koresh weaponized guilt. He reminded members constantly of their sinfulness, especially those who had doubts. Confessions were made public. Mistakes were tied to spiritual warfare. Kiri Jules says, quote, "He'd say we were chosen, but not worthy, that God was watching, that the end was close, and only the obedient would be saved." End quote. Fear of outsiders, of the government, of Satan, of spiritual death, kept people inside. But Koresh didn't only use fear. He gave his followers moments of elation too, promising redemption, divine favor, and a place at God's side in the final battle. David Thibodeau remembers, quote, "Sometimes he'd get this look in his eyes and say, 'You're going to see the face of God,' and you'd believe it. Those moments, he made you feel like you were part of something eternal." End quote. Together, these four pillars of control, behavior, information, thought, and emotion, formed a total system of domination, one that was invisible to those inside, one that transformed skepticism into faith, and faith into unquestioning obedience. And it's under this system that life continued inside Mount Carmel until early 1993, when the first signs of outside intervention finally arrived. By 1992, Mount Carmel was operating under the surface radar of Texas society, but the veil was beginning to lift. Former members were coming forward. Reports of child abuse and forced marriages began circulating. Neighbors complained about gunfire from the property. Rumors of illegal weapons stockpiling made their way to law enforcement. In June 1992, former Branch Davidian Mark Briault began actively warning others about Koresh, including Australian families whose children had joined the sect. Briault reached out to authorities and media. His detailed reports became crucial evidence in the case building against Koresh. Around the same time, Kiri Jules' mother took legal action, alleging Koresh had molested her daughter. Her sworn statements were forwarded to federal investigators. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, or ATF, began an investigation in July 1992. Surveillance of Mount Carmel increased. Agents learned of Koresh's weapons business, which involved mail-order gun parts and a large cache of semi-automatic rifles. In a request for a search warrant, the ATF claimed Koresh's group possessed illegal machine guns and grenades. A plan was drafted to serve warrants and arrest Koresh on federal weapons charges. But the Branch Davidians were already expecting confrontation. Koresh had long prophesied that Babylon, his term for the U.S. government, would come for them. In fact, he believed it would mark the opening of the fifth seal in the book of Revelation. Survivor David Thibodeau remembers, quote, "David told us, they'll come for us. It's written, and when they do, we'll be tested. We didn't know it would be so soon." End quote. Despite opportunities for negotiation, the ATF opted for a show of force. On the morning of February 28, 1993, 2 cattle trailers full of armed federal agents approached the Mount Carmel compound under the pretense of delivering a warrant. Agents later said they believed the Davidians would surrender peacefully. But when the first shots rang out, whether from inside the compound or from the ATF side remains debated. A firefight erupted. 4 agents were killed. 6 Branch Davidians died. Dozens more were injured. The siege had begun. What followed was a 51-day standoff. The FBI moved in. Negotiators made contact. Media from around the world descended on Waco, and inside Mount Carmel, over 80 men, women, and children waited, trapped in a theology of fear, obedience, and prophecy. The events that unfolded over the next 7 weeks would raise global questions about law enforcement overreach, religious freedom, and the very nature of belief. It would end in flames. But that inferno began here, with the prophet, a compound, and the system of control he used to keep it all together. In our next episode, we take you inside the 51-day siege, day by day. We'll hear the actual FBI negotiation tapes, analyze the tactics used by both sides, and reveal how spiritual conviction and government miscalculation collided in one of the most controversial law enforcement operations in U.S. history. I'm Rick Welch, and this is Prophet of Fire.